What does it mean to trust a door because someone in uniform tells you it is locked? In courtrooms, police stations, and safe houses scattered across the modern world, that promise has been repeated in many languages. Come forward. Tell the truth. Help us. We will protect you. It is one of the most solemn bargains a state can offer a human being standing at the edge of fear. At first, witness protection sounds almost mythic. A vanished name, a sealed address, a new beginning hidden just beyond the reach of violence. It belongs to the same imagination that believes maps can still hold blank spaces, that danger can be outrun by distance, that bureaucracy, if organized carefully enough, can build a wall between the hunted and the hunter. For many, that belief is not abstract. It is the last, fragile bridge between silence and testimony. But history is quieter and harsher than myth. Again and again, people who stepped forward were told they had crossed into safety, only to discover that safety is never just a matter of locks, guards, or secret files. It depends on people, on institutions, on whether the ones assigned to protect a life can resist money, pressure, ideology, vanity, fear, and the old human weakness of believing they can manage corruption without becoming part of it. This story begins there, in that narrow space between promise and betrayal. Not in one country and not in one era, but across continents and systems that were supposed to be different from one another. Criminal syndicates, intelligence networks, terror cells, war crimes tribunals, anti-mafia courts, democratic governments, federal agencies, different uniforms, different languages, the same terrible pattern. And so the real question is not simply how these witnesses died. It is why protection, the very idea meant to defend truth, so often failed at the moment it was most needed. When a person risks everything to speak, what exactly are they placing their faith in? And what happens when the danger is not outside the system, but already inside the room? What if the safest room in America could still echo with a whisper from the wrong man? In Boston, in the early 1980s, that question was not asked in public. The city wore its hard history like weathered stone. On the docks and in back rooms, loyalty was currency, and silence was often worth more than truth. John McIntyre was not a heroic figure in the simple sense. He moved in dangerous circles, close enough to organize crime, to understand its habits, its roots, its commerce in fear. But at some point, something shifted. Whether it was conscience, self-preservation, or exhaustion with the lies, he began to cooperate with federal investigators. And when he did, the state extended its oldest modern promise: speak, and we will keep you alive. For a while, that promise must have felt real. New procedures, secret interviews, controlled movements, careful language. The machinery of protection can look convincing when viewed from the inside. It has folders, protocols, official vehicles, men with credentials, and calm voices. It gives danger a shape that feels manageable. It suggests that violence, no matter how intimate, can be out-organized. But violence often survives by becoming intimate with the system meant to stop it. McIntyre's enemies did not find him through luck. They found him because the wall around him was not a wall at all. Information moved where it should never have traveled. Trust was traded. A federal shield became a corridor. When he was lured to what seemed like an ordinary meeting, the ending was already waiting for him. What followed was not just a murder. It was a demonstration, a signal sent to anyone watching from the shadows that the state's promise could be bought, bent, and broken. And that is the first wound in this story. Not simply that a witness died, but that the betrayal came from inside the architecture of safety itself. If protection depends on human integrity, What happens when integrity becomes the one thing missing? Can a promise protect more than the person who makes it? In Sicily, that question carried the weight of blood and memory. The island in the early 1990s was living through a season of reckoning. Judges, prosecutors, policemen, and informants were testing whether the Italian state could finally confront a criminal empire that had long learned how to live inside public institutions while pretending to stand outside them. Francesco Marino Mannoia had once belonged to that hidden machinery. He understood the chemistry of heroin, the discipline of silence, the architecture of mafia power. When he chose to cooperate with prosecutors, he did more than provide evidence. He violated a moral code enforced not by law, but by fear, loyalty, and the certainty of reprisal. The state answered with a vow. He would be protected, and so would the people closest to him. That assurance must have sounded like a new language: secret locations, armed guards, controlled movement, procedures designed to suggest that the old order was finally being replaced by something stronger and cleaner. Yet Sicily had spent generations teaching a darker lesson. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a badge, signs a form, checks a vehicle, and quietly passes information to the very men preparing an explosion. When Mannoia's sister was killed by a car bomb while under protection, the murder felt larger than one family's grief. It was a public message written in fire. Not just that the mafia could still punish betrayal, but that it could reach through the state's own fingers to do it. The bomb was not only an act of vengeance, it was an argument, a way of saying that institutions could be infiltrated, routines could be studied, and the distinction between guardian and accomplice could disappear. And so the tragedy became something more haunting than simple violence. It revealed how protection fails when corruption is not a crack in the wall, but part of the foundation. If a family can be touched even inside the circle of official care, then what exactly is safety made of? Laws, locks, or the far rarer thing a society keeps promising and struggling to deliver? Trust. What happens when the witness is not hidden in a distant safehouse, but standing in open court before the world? In The Hague, the language of protection sounded especially formal. International law, sealed testimony, judicial procedure, protective measures. Everything about the setting suggested distance from the rough improvisations of street crime. Here, in the aftermath of war, truth would be gathered carefully, named precisely, and preserved under the authority of a tribunal built to answer atrocity with law. But war leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves networks of loyalty, fear, and memory that do not dissolve when the shooting stops. During the tribunal process connected to crimes in the Balkans, witnesses who agreed to testify entered a new kind of danger. They were no longer only survivors or observers, they became symbols. Their words could implicate commanders, reshape public memory, and disturb the fragile myths entire communities used to survive the past. One witness, protected in theory by the mechanisms of international justice, was later murdered after cooperation had made him visible to forces still moving in the shadows. The details of such cases often arrive in fragments, names obscured, procedures partially hidden, silence layered over fear. But the larger meaning comes through clearly enough. Even in the most sophisticated legal settings, protection is never purely procedural. It depends on local enforcement, political will, secure handling of identity, and the difficult fact that a courtroom can expose a person long before a guard can save them. There is something especially sobering about failure at this level. A local police service can be corrupt. A national agency can be compromised. But an international tribunal is supposed to represent a higher promise, that truth, once lifted into the realm of law, can be defended by a broader human commitment. When that promise falters, the loss is not only personal, it shakes faith in the idea that justice can extend beyond borders without losing its power on the ground. And so this chapter leaves us with a hard reflection. Institutions can become grander, more global, more ceremonial. Yet the essential vulnerability remains unchanged. A witness is still a human being with an address, a routine, a family, a body. And if law cannot protect the mortal person who carries the truth, what part of justice has really been secured? What if the voice that calls you out of hiding sounds exactly like the one you were taught to trust? In the Philippines, during the years of the drug war, fear did not always arrive in secret. It moved openly through neighborhoods, through police reports, through television speeches, through the heavy silence that settles when people begin to understand that official language and mortal danger can start to resemble each other. The witness at the center of this chapter had once helped the machinery he later described. He knew how targets were chosen, how names became raids, how raids became deaths, and how those deaths were often explained. His testimony did not describe isolated excesses or one terrible mistake. It sketched a pattern, a method, a chain of command. That is what made him dangerous to the people he was prepared to identify. So he was placed under protection, relocated, told that procedure would now stand between him and the forces he had exposed. In theory, the arrangement was simple: secrecy, supervision, controlled movement, patience. He would remain hidden until he could testify. The state, having asked for courage, would now provide shelter. It is the formula repeated in every protection program. First the confession, then the promise. But one day, the promise arrived in the form of a phone call. Someone claiming authority told him to step outside for what sounded like an ordinary official purpose. The details were convincing. The tone was familiar. The instructions carried the texture of legitimacy. And that may be the cruelest part of all. Betrayal often works, not by breaking trust, but by imitating it perfectly. He left the protected space and entered the open street. Gunmen on a motorcycle were waiting. The attack was quick, public, practiced. By the time the noise faded into traffic, a witness who had agreed to speak about unlawful killing had himself become another body in the same landscape of impunity. And so the question darkens. When the threat wears the language of coordination and procedure, how does a witness know the difference between guidance and a trap? If the system can summon you in its own voice and deliver you to death, where does trust go then? Can a person ever truly disappear in a country built on records, screens, and searchable traces? In the United States, witness protection has long carried an aura of near perfection. New names, new cities, quiet streets in places no one from your former life would think to look. It is one of the most carefully managed reinventions a government can offer, built on the belief that a life can be broken cleanly in two and stitched back together under official watch. For a former Colombian trafficker who agreed to cooperate with American authorities, that belief must have felt almost miraculous. He had crossed from one world into another, from cartel routes and laundering channels to courtrooms, debriefings, and the language of federal procedure. His testimony had value not only because it described the movement of cocaine, but because it illuminated the infrastructure around it, the money, the corruption, the reach that extended beyond borders. Once he had served that purpose, he was given what many assume is the strongest shield available: a new identity in America, a new city, a promise that the old life was over. And yet disappearance is rarely absolute. The modern world leaks. A phone call leaves a pattern. A legal filing leaves a clue. A document, even when partially concealed, may still reveal enough for a patient adversary. Protection programs are often imagined as fortresses, but they are really mosaics made of many small pieces. Disciplined behavior, competent redaction, discreet administrators, ethical lawyers, careful clerks, invisible routines. If even one tile slips, the whole image begins to crack. When the informant was shot outside a grocery store in the city where he had been resettled, the scene exposed a painful contradiction. The safest program in the world had not been broken by a dramatic raid or a spectacular insider conspiracy. It had been undone by accumulation. Small traces, small errors, small acts of human longing and bureaucratic imprecision. Perhaps a call home, perhaps a clue in court papers, perhaps information passed through hands that never expected blood to follow. That is what makes this chapter so unsettling. Not all failures arrive as betrayal in the grand sense. Sometimes the system fails because secrecy is fragile in an age built to connect everything. And if a protected life can be reconstructed from fragments, then what does safety mean in a world where nothing stays wholly hidden for long? What if the person assigned to watch the door is carrying his own divided loyalties? In Greece, where the memory of political violence has lingered across generations, witness protection carried a different kind of burden. This was not only about organized crime or money. It was about ideology, grievance, old networks of belief, and the uncomfortable truth that violence justified by ideas can blur the line between enemy, sympathizer, and protector. The witness in this chapter had once moved inside that world. He had belonged to a domestic extremist organization and knew its internal rhythm, the coded language, the safe apartments, the weapons, the logic that turns abstraction into bloodshed. When he chose to cooperate with police, he was not simply betraying former associates, he was stepping out of a moral universe that demanded loyalty even unto death. In return, the state offered what it always offers in such moments: secrecy, armed protection, a managed transition from danger into safety. On paper, the arrangement was sound: restricted access, guards, controlled movement, assurances that only a trusted circle knew where he was being held. But ideological violence creates a special weakness inside institutions. Not everyone who wears a uniform is immune to the passions moving through the society around them. Some officers may have private sympathies, others may have family ties, old friendships, hidden resentments, or simply a reluctance to treat political militants with the same clarity reserved for ordinary criminals. In that ambiguity, security begins to thin. When the witness was killed despite police protection, the murder struck with more than physical force. It suggested that the breach was not random. Someone had known enough. Someone had talked, looked away, or failed at precisely the moment failure became fatal. As in so many of these cases, the exact path from secrecy to assassination remained clouded. But the result was unmistakable. A protected witness had been reached, and every future witness was left to absorb the message. That is the haunting reflection Greece offers this story. Protection is not weakened only by greed. Sometimes it is weakened by conviction, by cultural nearness, by the dangerous softness that institutions can feel toward those whose motives seem political rather than criminal. And if justice depends on people who must stand above the conflict, what happens when they are still quietly inside it? How do you hide from an enemy that has already learned to live among civilians, to wait, to listen, to endure? In Iraq, during the long years after invasion and insurgency, witness protection often existed less as a stable institution than as a fragile improvisation. Safe houses, military escorts, confidential movements, relocated families. The promise was real in intention, but it was being made inside a country where violence had seeped into roads, ministries, neighborhoods, and rumor itself. The witness at the center of this chapter had agreed to help identify members of a militant network responsible for bombings and killings. That decision carried a particular kind of danger. Unlike organized crime, which may calculate risk in terms of money and exposure, insurgent groups often treat informants as symbols. To kill one is not only to remove a threat, it is to shape the emotional climate around cooperation, to turn fear into policy without ever writing a law. So the witness and his family were moved, guarded, told that new procedures would interrupt the old path of retaliation. Yet insurgent organizations are often built precisely to survive disruption. They rely on cousins, neighbors, coerced shopkeepers, sympathetic officials, street-level watchers, and the simple fact that movement in unstable places is difficult to conceal. A child notices a vehicle. A landlord asks a question. A checkpoint officer remembers a face. Information travels not through one great betrayal, but through dozens of ordinary observations. When the safe location was attacked and the witness was killed, the murder revealed how narrow the margin of protection can be in a fractured society. The guards may be committed, the paperwork may be classified, but secrecy is hard to maintain where war has made every civilian space porous. In such places, a witness is not just protected by walls. He is protected or endangered by the surrounding culture of fear, by the capacity of the state, and by whether local people believe survival lies with law or with whoever holds the gun tonight. That is the deeper sorrow here. Protection assumes a functioning perimeter between order and chaos. Iraq showed what happens when that perimeter barely exists. And if truth depends on stable institutions to shelter it, what becomes of truth in places where institutions themselves are still struggling to survive? What if the danger is not that the state cannot protect you, but that it no longer remembers why it should? In Northern Ireland, the history of informants lives inside a landscape already crowded with ghosts. Streets carry old allegiances. Murals remember the dead. Families inherit narratives the way other families inherit furniture. In such a place, witness protection is never merely administrative. It touches memory, identity, and the unresolved ache of conflict. The man in this chapter had become an informer within a paramilitary world where betrayal was treated as the deepest of sins. His value to security services came from his nearness to violence, from what he could reveal about operations, loyalties, and intentions. But that same nearness made him permanently vulnerable. To cooperate was to enter a bargain that could never be clean. He was useful to the state precisely because he had once been trusted by men now willing to kill him. Protection in such settings is unusually complex. Intelligence agencies may want continued access. Police may want prosecutions. Political actors may fear the consequences of exposure. Communities may already suspect that informers are being managed rather than fully rescued. The result can be a blurred moral field where a witness is neither fully hidden nor fully released, neither simply a citizen nor merely an asset. He exists in suspension, dependent on systems that may not even share the same priorities. When that witness was ultimately murdered despite prior state involvement in his security, the killing carried a bitter ambiguity. Was it failure, neglect, calculation, or the slow erosion of responsibility once his usefulness had diminished? In conflicts shaped by covert work, answers are rarely clean. Records remain sealed. Officials speak carefully. Families are left to reconstruct the truth from fragments, delay, and institutional silence. Yet the emotional reality is unmistakable. A man who entered the shadow world of cooperation was left exposed to the shadow world he helped illuminate. Northern Ireland adds a painful layer to this story because it reminds us that protection can be compromised not only by corruption or incompetence, but by ambiguity itself. When a witness becomes entangled in intelligence strategy, does the duty to protect remain absolute? Or can a person slowly be reclassified from life to liability? That question lingers far beyond one killing, because wherever secrecy governs policy, human beings can begin to disappear morally long before they disappear physically. What happens when protection is offered in a place where the state has never fully defeated fear? In Mexico, the answer has often unfolded in a landscape where witnesses are asked to stand against organizations with extraordinary reach. Cartels do not only control gunmen. They influence police, monitor roads, buy information, intimidate families, and make examples of anyone who threatens the flow of money and silence. In that world, witness protection is less like stepping behind a wall and more like walking into a room whose locks may already have been copied. The witness in this chapter had agreed to cooperate in a case connected to organized criminal violence, and that choice carried the familiar mixture of hope and dread. To speak was to believe that institutions, however imperfect, still possessed enough strength to shelter truth. Officials arranged protection. Movements were restricted. Contacts were managed. Procedures were designed to create the impression of distance between the witness and those who wanted him dead. But in environments saturated by corruption, procedure can become performance. It looks like security from the outside, while quietly leaking danger from within. The fatal weakness is often not spectacular. It can be an address repeated in the wrong office, a route revealed by habit, an officer with debts, a clerk under pressure, a family member followed, a local official who has already made peace with criminal power. Bit by bit, the protected person becomes visible again. Not fully, just enough. Enough for a car to wait, enough for armed men to arrive before help does, enough for the state's promise to collapse in a matter of seconds. When the witness was killed, despite being under official protection, the murder carried the same brutal message seen across so many borders. Your cooperation has limits, and our reach does not. Yet Mexico's version of that message feels especially stark because it emerges where violence is not merely criminal, but civic, economic, and territorial all at once. It seeps into institutions meant to resist it. And so the question deepens again. Can a protection system function where the surrounding state is uneven, fragmented, or afraid? Or does safety require something larger than relocation and guards, something more difficult to build and easier to lose? A public order in which truth is not always the most dangerous thing a person can carry. What if the most fragile place in any protection program is not the safe house, but the human heart inside it? By now, the pattern in this story feels painfully familiar. A witness steps forward, the state responds with secrecy and procedure, and somewhere between promise and reality the line of safety gives way. Yet there is another kind of failure, quieter and more intimate, that runs beneath many of these cases. Not betrayal by an officer, not infiltration by a gang, but the simple, devastating difficulty of asking a person to stop being who they have been. Protection does not only move bodies, it tries to reorder memory. A new name must be spoken until it sounds natural. Old numbers must go unanswered. Favorite streets must be forgotten. Friends become hazards. Family becomes risk. Home becomes the very thing one must never return to. For some witnesses, especially those shaped by tight communities, criminal subcultures, or lifelong habits of movement and contact, this is almost unbearable. The danger is no longer only external. It begins to rise from loneliness, restlessness, guilt, nostalgia, and the stubborn human need to be known by someone who remembers your real name. Across many witness killings, this hidden pressure keeps resurfacing. A call to a relative, a secret meeting with a former lover, a return to a familiar neighborhood, a moment of impatience with the rules. Sometimes the break comes because the protected person feels caged, sometimes because life under protection feels less like rescue than erasure, and sometimes because people who have lived for years under threat also become strangely accustomed to it, as if fear itself were part of their identity. When those small acts of return lead to discovery and death, officials may describe the outcome as a breach of protocol. But that phrase is too cold for what it really means. It means the program asked for obedience without always understanding grief. It means survival required a kind of emotional exile few people are prepared to endure. So this chapter turns inward. A witness protection system can change documents, cities, and routines, but can it truly remake the emotional architecture of a life? And if safety demands a person abandon every thread connecting them to their own past, at what point does protection begin to resemble another kind of loss? What if every failed protection case is really telling the same story in different accents? By this point, the geography has widened. Boston, Sicily, The Hague, Manila, American suburbs, Athens, Baghdad, Belfast, Mexican cities, but the underlying design keeps repeating itself. Different enemies, different institutions, different legal systems. Yet the points of collapse are strikingly familiar. Information leaks, loyalties bend, procedures become habits. Fear outpaces paperwork. Human beings, with all their contradictions, remain the weakest and most important part of every system built to defend truth. Seen from a distance, witness protection is often imagined as a technical problem. Change the identity, secure the residence, limit the contact, assign the guards, move the family. But these stories reveal something more difficult. Protection is not merely logistical. It is moral, cultural, psychological, and political all at once. It depends on whether institutions value the witness after the testimony is useful. It depends on whether officers believe in the mission more deeply than they fear the consequences. It depends on whether secrecy can survive bureaucracy, whether courage can survive isolation, and whether a society truly wants to know what the witness is prepared to say. That is why the deaths feel larger than individual tragedy. Each one sends a signal far beyond the immediate crime. To future witnesses, it says, measure the promise carefully. To criminal networks and extremist groups, it says, the state can still be penetrated. To the public, it says something even more unsettling. Truth may be invited into the courtroom, but that does not mean truth is loved enough to be protected afterward. And yet the answer cannot simply be despair. If these cases teach anything, it is that institutions fail most completely when they mistake secrecy for safety and procedure for trust. Real protection asks more. It asks for integrity strong enough to resist corruption, empathy deep enough to understand exile, and patience broad enough to treat a witness not as evidence on legs, but as a whole human life. So the question that remains is no longer only how these people died. It is what their deaths reveal about us. When a society asks someone to risk everything for the truth, what does it owe in return? And how much of its own character is exposed by whether it keeps that promise? What remains after the files are sealed, the headlines fade, and the names begin to blur? Often, it is not the official lesson, but the private one. A chair left empty at a kitchen table. A sister who no longer answers. A child growing older with only fragments of explanation. Systems speak in the language of risk assessment and operational compromise. Families speak in the language of absence. Between those two vocabularies lies the true cost of a broken promise. This is where the story turns from institutions to memory, because every witness who dies under protection leaves behind more than a failed case. They leave behind a question for the living. Was the truth worth it? Not in the abstract language of history books, but in the intimate arithmetic of ordinary life. Was it worth the relocation, the fear, the hiding, the isolation, the last phone call, the final moment of realizing the promised shield had thinned to nothing? Such questions do not lend themselves to heroic answers. They remain tender, unresolved, and painfully human. And yet memory does something unexpected. It refuses to stay only in grief. Over time, these lives begin to illuminate the hidden architecture of power more clearly than any official briefing. They show us that violence survives not only through weapons, but through doubt. Through the belief that speaking changes nothing. Through the quiet persuasion that institutions are too compromised, too weary, or too self-protective to defend those who tell the truth. In that sense, every murdered witness is part of a larger struggle over whether truth can still command collective courage. There is a haunting paradox here. The witness may be killed, but the testimony often outlives the killer's intentions. A statement enters the record. A name surfaces. A network becomes visible. A public, however briefly, is forced to see what was meant to remain hidden. Death silences a voice, but it can also sharpen its echo. So this chapter asks us to sit with a difficult reflection. Perhaps the measure of a society is not whether danger exists. Danger always will. Perhaps the measure is whether memory is allowed to deepen into responsibility. When we inherit these stories, do we treat them as cautionary tales and move on? Or do we hear in them a quieter demand to build institutions worthy of the courage they ask from the vulnerable? In the end, the story is not only about murder, it is about the fragile architecture of human trust. Across continents and decades, people stepped out of danger long enough to tell the truth, and in doing so, they entered a different kind of danger, one shaped not only by criminals, militants, or corrupt networks, but by the limits of the institutions that asked them to speak. The names change, the uniforms change, the promises are often spoken with great sincerity. Yet sincerity alone has never been enough to keep a person alive. What these stories reveal, when gathered together, is something larger than the failure of individual programs. They reveal a permanent tension at the center of modern justice. Truth is indispensable, yet truth usually arrives through vulnerable people. Courts, commissions, police units, and tribunals all depend on testimony, But testimony is not an idea floating safely above the world. It is carried in bodies that can be followed, frightened, isolated, bribed, betrayed, or forgotten. A witness is not a piece of evidence. A witness is a mortal human being standing between memory and denial. And still, despite everything, people continue to speak. That may be the most remarkable part of all, not because they are fearless, but because fear does not fully extinguish the hope that truth might matter. Some step forward for justice, some for remorse, some for revenge, some simply because silence has become unbearable. Whatever the reason, their decision exposes the moral quality of the society receiving it. Do we treat that courage as sacred for as long as the cameras are on, then let it dissolve into paperwork? Or do we understand that protection is not a favor granted to the useful, but a test of whether law can be more faithful than violence? Perhaps that is where this journey leaves us, with a question that belongs not only to judges or governments, but to all of us. In every age, truth asks for witnesses, and witnesses, in every age, ask whether anyone will stand with them once the speaking begins. The answer we give shapes more than a verdict. It shapes the future of trust itself, and whether the next frightened voice will choose silence or step into the light.